we may have a quorum, and we're also going to be recording this session, so it'll be easy to share it with folks who come in late or couldn't make it. My name is Sam Myers. I'm the director of the Planetary Health Alliance and a principal research scientist at in the Department of Environmental Health at the Harvard Chan School of Public Health. And we have our third talk in the Planetary Health Colloquium series today. We are really, really lucky to have three people joining us to sort of blend a very broad set of different expertises. So first we have Lucas Garibaldi, who's the director of the Institute for Research in Natural Resources, Agroecology, and Rural Development at the National University of Rio Negro in Argentina. He's also on the National Scientific and Technical Research Council. Lucas is one of the world's leading pollinator ecologists, and he has a strong focus as well on bringing his science into action at the policy level. So he's written summaries for policymakers and helped to draft several bills before the Argentinian Senate. He's also the president of the Pollination and Bee Flora Commission of the International Federation of Beekeeping Associations. And I had the pleasure of meeting Lucas several years ago when he came to speak at Harvard about really exciting work that he's led quantifying the role of wild pollinators in supporting crop production across experimental farms on several different continents. So it will be great to have Lucas start with about 10 minutes or so, just talking about his work to understand the role of wild pollinators in supporting global crop production. And then Matt Smith is going to pick up the reins and talk about how we translate that work on the importance of pollination for crop yields into the potential health effects of insufficient wild pollinator populations. And Matt is a research scientist here in the Department of Environmental Health at the Chan School. His work uses global models of major environmental changes, so working on pollinator populations, rising carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, dwindling wild fish stocks, all really to quantify how those large-scale environmental changes are impacting diets, nutrition, and health. At the center of all of that work, much of which Matt and I have been doing together, he was really the sort of chief architect of the global expanded nutrient supply database, which is a really important tool that he's developed, which estimates the macro and micronutrients provided by all foods in the diet, broken down by country and age and sex group for about 150 countries around the world. And then finally, we're really honored to have Frank Hu sort of leading a discussion. Frank chairs the Department of Nutrition here at the School of Public Health. He's the Frederick Stare Professor of Nutrition and Epidemiology at the Chan School. He's also a professor of medicine at the Harvard Medical School, wears many hats. He's the director of the Boston Nutrition Obesity Research Center and also co-director of the program in obesity epidemiology and prevention at the School of Public Health. And Frank's research interests include epidemiology and prevention of cardiometabolic diseases, which is interesting for today's talk because the very end of the pathway in connecting Lucas's pollination work and Matt's modeling of crop yields and health effects is really impacts on primarily non-communicable diseases, including cardiometabolic diseases. And so Frank's interest is cardiometabolic diseases through diet and lifestyle, gene-environment interactions, nutritional metabolomics, and nutrition transitions and cardiometabolic diseases in low and middle income countries. So we're sort of stitching together several areas of work to tell a planetary health story. So let me get out of the way and let Lucas start by talking about his really interesting work in pollinator ecology. Lucas, I think, oh, there you go.
Yeah. Can you see my screen?
Looks good.
Yeah. Thank you, Sam. I'm very happy to be here. It's a great honor also to work with you. So we have been thinking about this idea of how pollinator health is connected with human health, and we have organized this in four pathways. First, we have defined pollinator health as pollinator diversity. When we thought, when we think about pollinators, we think about bees and we think about honeybees especially. And honeybees are great, are a beautiful species, but there are more than 20,000 bee species in the world. And bees are not the only pollinators. There are also other pollinators like butterflies, wasps, and many other animal species. So really when we think about pollinator health, it's important to define it as a community level, as pollinator diversity. So when we increase pollinator diversity, one pathway for benefits to human health is that we increase pollination of pollinator-dependent plants. And some of these plants, we call them crops. So better crop pollination implies better amount and quality of food, so that improves our nutrition. Most of the crops that we grow globally, they are pollinator dependent to some degree. So this is a really important aspect. And another important aspect is that there are more than 28,000 plants, medicinal plants, that are also pollinator dependent. So pollinators are also important not only to provide food, but also to provide medicines for humans. So the second pathway is that we also improve pollinator-derived products like honey or propolis, and these are also important for our health. And the third part of pathway is that when we want to protect pollinator diversity, we need to provide nesting and floral resources, and that implies some way contributing to green species and preserving or restoring biocultural landscape. And this is really important from a mental health point of view. And the fourth pathway is that pollinator initiatives or initiatives to conserve pollinators, they usually focus on decrease the use of pesticides and pollutants in general, and that contributes to more healthy environments in terms of clean water, air, and food. So now I will focus only on the first pathway, that is the contribution of pollinators to nutrition, in particular to crop productivity. And we wanted to understand how important is pollination to crop yield or crop productivity. Crop yield is productivity per hectare in real food landscape, so for real farmers. So in each one of these blue dots, we have several fields of the same crop. Some of these fields were managed to improve pollinator abundance and diversity, and the other fields were managed as usual. And in each one of the blue dots, we have a different crops. So we work with a wide spectrum of different crops all over the world, and with large, extensive crops, and also with smallholders. And overall, we found that if we improve pollinator and pollination management, we can improve crop productivity on average by 24%. So 24% is a lot. Nowadays, with the conventional practices, it's very difficult to increase a crop yield by more than 1 or 2%. And we have seen here that by incorporating pollinator management in real farms and measuring crop yield in the same way that farmers do, we can increase crop productivity by a lot. So these results was amazing, even for us that we are pollinator fans. Uh, so because we have found that there is a lack of pollen and pollinators all over the world, and despite that we work with very different crops in very different regions, there is a clear signal that our crops need more pollen in their flowers, or say it in another way, if they have better pollination, crop yield can increase by a lot. And this is because the way that we do agriculture currently all over the world is the perfect recipe for pollinator deficit. So deficit is an imbalance between offer and demand. On the one side, you can see in this photo, there is a huge demand of pollen because we create crop monocultures with a short flowering period, and you have millions and millions of flowers that are demanding a great amount of pollen. But the same way of doing agriculture destroyed the habitat for pollinators, because you can see in this photo that there is no place for the pollinators to nest here. And also when the crop flowering is off, that means most of the year they don't have resources. There are no other flowers to visit. So great amount of pollen and lack of pollen offer because of lack of pollinators create this huge pollinator deficit that we are finding all over the world, not only with the previous study, but with different methodologies and different studies. This is a common pattern. So integrating many empirical studies, we have created this graph, and we have provided empirical data of these curves for different crops. So here you can see how crop yield changes with the flower visitation rate. That means the amount of uh, animals that visit the flowers. And we have several curves according to the diversity. So if you focus on the line on the bottom, you can see that it says low richness. You can think that as how crop yield, for example, the amount of apples you harvest, change with the increase in abundance of one pollinators, for example, honeybee. And you can see that from left to right, you can think about you increase the number of hives of honeybees in your field, so you harvest more until an optimum, and then you harvest less. So you need an optimal amount of honeybees for crop yield, and if you have too many, crop yield is going to be less than optimal. There are many mechanisms to explain that, and we can discuss that later. But if you have more diversity, the same amount of insects will create a greater yield, because pollination is more efficient and you have synergies among the different pollinator species. And we can discuss more also later about this mechanism. But in another way, you need both. So abundance of pollinators, because you need to move from left to right in that graph. And you also need diversity of pollinators, because you need to move from the bottom to the top on that graph. So to do that, you need species management. So you need honeybees or bumblebees, because you can bring them to many places when you need. But you also need habitat, natural or semi-natural habitat within agricultural landscape to provide these resources for pollinator communities in a way to increase crop yield. And also crop yield also depend on pollinators, not only for short-term productivity, but also for crop stability. And this is a very important aspect, crop yield stability. So it's important to be able to harvest production each year. And we have seen here from left to right, from top to bottom, that when you increase the level of pollinator deficit over the years, you have much more variability, as you can see there, in the amount of yield that you harvest. And this is a great problem also to farmers, for farming companies, and also to predict the amount of food that we are going to have. So not only mean yield is dependent on pollination, but also yield stability and also yield quality. But because of time, I'm not going to discuss that. So thank you, and I leave it to Matt now.
Fantastic. Thank you, Lucas. Matt, want to jump in?
Sure. So let me share my screen. Can you see the slides? Yep. Okay.
Yes.
So yeah, so I'm going to take the handoff from Lucas and focus my talk more on the role of pollinators in the global food system and trying to understand how their action flows through that system and comes to support health. So I'd like to begin with a quote from Occam Steiner, who is the administrator of the United Nations Development Program, who said that human beings have fabricated the illusion that in the 21st century, they have the technological prowess to be independent of nature. And that bees underline the reality that we are more, not less, dependent on nature's services in a world of close to 7 billion people. And despite being a little dated because of that 7 billion line, it's what I like about this quote is that it really underlines the concept that we are all reliant on many systems that and services in the natural world that are out of our control, but are influenced by us. And so pollinators provide a powerful example of that intricate link between nature and health. So, but before we arrive at the idea of pollinators as health workers, I wanted to first think of them as farm workers, because like Lucas said, they support our global food system by pollinating many of the important crops that we eat and improving their yields and quality. And I'll dive more into how they do that in a minute. I'll also point out that this is what Lucas mentioned at the beginning of his talk, but just to give them full billing, they do a lot of other things besides just pollinate our food. So that support not only nature, but our health. So they visit over 90% of global flowering plant species. They supply us honey and medicine. They pollinate biofuel and timber and fiber crops. They benefit landscapes that support mental health, and they also have cultural and spiritual significance for many civilizations. So, but we're talking about food today, so I will return there. So we have this global food system that fundamentally relies on this contribution of an essentially free resource that is not often visible, and that's animal pollinators. And like Lucas mentioned, they're, insects and birds and mammals, animal pollinators is a really rich diversity of, it's a really diverse community. But all of them just visit flowers, they transport and deposit pollen, and they support plant reproduction and fruiting. But most of the animal pollinators we're talking about are insects. So bees and flies and wasps, beetles and moths, butterflies. So just to give a general, I guess just to start with a general overview of the relationship between pollinators and food. So pollinators support, they improve or they wholly support the yield of over 3/4 of our food crop species. And so as you can see in this bar chart, which shows the global agricultural food production on the y-axis, the animal pollinated crops are in this bar on the right, and they are predominantly healthy and nutritious food groups like fruits and vegetables, nuts and legumes, and some roots and tubers. And you'll also notice that this right bar is shorter, meaning that animal pollinated crops represent a smaller amount of the global total food production, about only 35% by tonnage. And that's because many staple foods that are prolific, like grains and sugar crops, are either self or wind pollinated. So over here in the left bar. So they're not reliant on animal pollination for their yield. But this seemingly innocuous 35% number has led to some misconceptions about pollinators and food. So in particular, some people have kind of stretched the meaning of that term by lending it to one of the most widely circulated phrases about pollinators and food, that appears in nearly every news story that discusses them, which is that, I mean, you might have even heard it, which is that 1 of every 3 bites of food depends on pollinators, or pollinators support 1 of every 3 bites of food you eat, something to that effect. And it's often invoked with different levels of care and using words like they're responsible for, or that food depends on pollinators. And the phrase is so widespread that in 2018, the American Entomologist, which is the official journal of the Entomological Society of America, published a commentary arguing against the use of the phrase, saying that it was colorful and catchy, but vague to the point of being essentially meaningless. And so it also included this cartoon of a bee trying to claim a third of a banana split, which I liked a lot. So I'm bringing this point up at the top just to kind of ground our discussion of pollinators and food in the facts. And I'm hoping to highlight the crucial role that pollinators play in our food system without getting bogged down in myths. So the issue with the 1/3 number is that it's often left unclear whether 1/3 of our food would actually just fully disappear if pollinators didn't exist. But really, pollinators don't tend to provide sort of all or nothing support to the plants they visit. And they often will only give a small yield benefit, something like 5 or 10% rather than all of it. And so some researchers about a decade ago, including Lucas, did the work of multiplying the amount of each crop's yield that we thought was directly linked to animal pollination by that crop's total production over time, to estimate how much food has actually been produced directly by animal pollination. And they estimated that pollinators are only responsible for between 3 and 8% of, directly responsible for 3 to 8% of crop production. And that's shown in these 2 plots, which break down the pollinator reliance by across the developed and the developing world. And still an important number, but certainly short of a third. And because animal pollinated foods are often fresh and water-rich foods like fruits and vegetables, that amount translates to about 2.5% of calories that are directly provided by pollinators, which is a pretty modest amount. And this is just a short chart to that effect, which shows the productive calories that directly related to animal pollination is just at the top. And so these somewhat moderate numbers are maybe why pollinators can sometimes feel sidelined, or why their contribution feels like it may need to be inflated when measuring their importance to the global food system. But I'm going to spend most of the rest of my time today trying to convince you that pollinators, even though small, are mighty helpers in helping in providing food and health. And much of my argument hinges on the point that despite their seemingly small contribution to the human food supply by some measures, the specific types of foods that are pollinated are outsized contributors in many ways. So first, the foods that they pollinate are rich sources of micronutrients. And so despite providing a relatively small amounts of macronutrients like calories and fat and protein, they provide quite a bit of micronutrients to the diet. So 7% of global folate production, 9% of calcium production, 20% of vitamin C, which I don't show here, and up to 40% of vitamin A is directly related to pollinators. And then second, and more important to their global health footprint, I think, is that the specific food groups that pollinators are supporting are incredibly critical to protecting human health. And so here what I mean is that there's a significant relationship between higher intakes of fruit, vegetables, and nuts, and a lower incidence and mortality from a suite of major chronic or non-communicable diseases. So heart disease, stroke, many cancers, and type 2 diabetes. And to get a sense of the importance of how low intakes of these foods are currently endangering human health, in 2019, an estimated 2.2 million deaths were caused by diets that were either low in fruit, vegetables, or nuts. And that means that 6% of all deaths globally that could be attributed to a specific risk factor may be caused by eating too few of one of these food groups. So we know that eating pollinated foods are beneficial for human health, but our group wanted to answer the question, how much benefit are pollinators providing to humans right now by pollinating these healthy and nutritious foods? And so to answer that question, we published a study a few years ago in The Lancet where we tried to envision an extreme case of a full removal of pollinators and the food and nutrients they provide. So to summarize very briefly how we did this, we first removed the food that was assumed to have been contributed by pollinators using what we knew about the percentage yield reliance on each food type on animal pollination. And then we replaced those calories by just increasing staple foods. And the idea was to use this as a way to assess the importance of pollinators to food production and to health. And we wanted to look at that importance to health across those two dimensions. So both understanding how a loss of micronutrients could affect health. So across micronutrients that are key contributors to health and also dependent on pollination. So we chose folate and vitamin A. And then the second was the health burden from the rise of chronic disease that's caused by the loss of these healthy food groups. And what we found was that a full removal of pollinators would reduce global fruit, vegetable, nut, and seed supplies by around 20%, which together would cause an additional 1.4 million deaths a year, which is a 2.7% increase in mortality. And that's what's shown in this bar chart. There's a lot going on here, but this is just that mortality value broken down by risk factor, by cause, and by region. And the blue colors here indicate health outcomes that are related to lost fruit intake. The green is from lost vegetable intake. The red is from lost nut and seed intake. And then the gray and the yellow, which are related to these nutritional deficiency outcomes, are basically invisible on this chart because they're such a negligible contributor. And though I'll note that we're only limited to empirically robust relative risk relationships here, which for vitamin A are only for children under 5 and for folate are only for pregnant women. So the known risks are significantly narrowed for these nutritional deficiency outcomes. We also analyzed the life years that were lost to the disability and death from all these diseases. And we estimated an annual increase of 27 million life years lost, which is a 1.1% increase. And shown here is just that geographic distribution of the per capita life years lost. And this is just from the chronic disease, but that's basically all of them. And here you can see that there's disproportionate harm in certain areas. And these tended to be places where underlying rates of chronic disease were high and reliance on animal pollinated foods was also the greatest. So in Eastern Europe, Asia, North Africa, and to a lesser degree, Europe and North America. So the goal of this early work was an attempt to answer the question, so what are pollinators doing for us right now, by sort of imagining their absence? But it's also possible to kind of switch angles and look at the importance of pollinators from a different perspective, which begins at looking more closely at the status of pollinators right now. And right now, global pollinators are in a weakened state. So here I'm specifically talking about wild pollinators. And wherever long-term records exist, wild pollinators have been declining in occurrence or diversity and range, as well as abundance for many species. And the cause of this is complex, but it's rooted at the intersection of a wide variety of anthropogenic factors, so such as land use change that's driving landscape fragmentation. There are intensive agricultural practices like heavy pesticide use, frequent tilling, sowing vast monocultures that kind of condense the bloom times where bees can feed, so it causes nutritional stress. There's increased pollution from urban and agricultural runoff. There's invasive species and pests that are moving in response to human pressures. And of course, there's climate change on top of all of this that's shifting temperature ranges and limiting suitable habitats for pollinators. And unless addressed, all of these drivers are really expected to worsen or at least stay constant in the future. And like Lucas said, what he highlighted with his work is that the current insufficiency of pollinators is already having consequences for food, finding that about 25% of the gap between the average and a high yielding farm could be filled if we had more pollinators. So we wanted to ask another question about the importance of pollinators to the food system, which is, what food and health benefits are we missing by having too few pollinators? And so this analysis, which is currently finished, but we're preparing to submit, required the coordination of many different modeling teams to answer. And I'm going to walk through kind of the multi-step of this process. So we first needed to know the gap in each country between what's currently being grown and what could conceivably be grown, which we accomplished by looking globally at groupings of farmland that had similar climate conditions, calculating the 90th percentile yields of those groups, and then kind of applying that to each country given its mix of climate constraints. So we did that for each of 63 different pollinated crops. Then we used Lucas's empirical work to identify what percentage of that gap was attributable to insufficient pollination, which we call the pollinator deficit, which is about 25%. Then we imagined this counterfactual world where pollinators were abundant and diverse, and where those pollinator deficit yields could be closed to understand how much additional food could have been produced. And then we had to understand how global economic and trade systems might redistribute that food to where it would ultimately be eaten. So we used the impact model, which is this global model that was developed by the team at IFPRI over the course of the last decade at least, and uses a whole suite of price elasticities and cross-price elasticities across commodity groups to model how changes in yields and prices shift the global distribution of demands for certain foods. And then finally, we assessed what that extra healthy food consumption would do to improve chronic disease rates and outcomes, and then compare that to the present day to see what we might be missing in terms of an opportunity to improve health. And in order to complete an analysis that broad, we had to pull together this amazing team of experts across all of these individual pieces. And it was such a sprawling analysis. I'm so incredibly grateful to this group for pulling this together. But what we found was that these pollinator deficits are currently causing 3 to 5% less fruit, vegetable, and nut production. And that flowing through results in 427,000 additional deaths per year. And these outcomes were unevenly distributed, with lost production being concentrated primarily in lower income countries where yields are lagging the furthest behind their potential. But then the health outcomes are actually focused in many middle income countries and higher income countries seen here. And so parts of Eastern Europe, it's a similar map to the one before actually, but parts of Eastern Europe, Russia, China, India, huge population centers. So we also looked at the loss of economic value that's associated with that lower production of high value foods. And here we focused on 3 case study countries, which were Honduras, Nigeria, and Nepal, which we chose to span a range of geographies and sizes and agricultural styles. And we found that they are losing somewhere between 12 and 31% of their agricultural economic productivity due to insufficient pollination, which is a considerable loss in these countries where incomes are generally low and agriculture is a huge part of the economy. So in Honduras and Nigeria, the percentage of people employed in agriculture is about 1/3 and up to 2/3 in Nepal. And in all of these countries, it was the loss of valuable fruit and vegetable production that was driving most of this gap, and minor contributions from other cash crops. So where does this leave us for the future? So there are unfortunately many trends that are intersecting to potentially deepen these problems that I'm talking about. So first, pollinated foods are continuing to become a bigger part of our diet. Fruit and vegetable intake is expected to grow by 40% globally by 2050. And that's assuming a continuation of current dietary trends that are not really optimal for health or the environment. And if you try to optimize for those things, as they did in the recent Eat Lancet Commission report, which tried to optimize balancing health and environmental considerations, fruit, vegetable, and nut intakes would need to increase even more over status quo. So 63% increases in fruit and vegetable intake and more than doubling of nut intake. And at the same time, pollinators are expected to continue their decline as most of these drivers of recent losses are expected to persist or worsen. So ongoing land use change, accelerating climate change, a lack of floral and nesting resources, and persistent pest and pathogen pressures. And then finally, chronic disease rates are likely to continue to rise at the same time. So at a minimum, prevalences tend to track population growth at least over this past several decades. But a more severe scenario could envision that growing incomes and changing diets could lead to a rise in metabolic disease rates in developing countries. And that puts even more of an emphasis on the need for these healthier components of the diet to continue to lend their protective effect. And so all of these add up to the point that supporting pollinators is only going to become more, not less important over time. And the bright spot here, if there is one, is that there are many effective interventions that are well known to stop or reverse these trends. But like many of the fixes for these big environmental change or problems we have today, it comes down to an issue of will and resources. So, but the best established strategies I'll mention here. So one is increasing the amount of natural and semi-natural habitat that are near farms so that bees with different foraging ranges can live nearby and effectively pollinate crops. And also establishing a diversity of nectar resources for bees that bloom over the full year so that they have an ability to feed. It might also be necessary to reward farmers to adopt some of these pollinator-friendly practices to make it less of a financial burden to be proactive. And as wild pollinators continue to suffer, improving managed pollinator husbandry may increase the viability of these managed operations to partially fill that gap. And then finally, supporting diversified farms, which promote agrobiodiversity on the farm rather than monocultures, as well as organic practices such as less tilling and a use of and less harmful chemicals could really benefit pollinators. So just in summary, so pollinators provide key nutrients to the diet. And more importantly for our health, they support the yields of many healthy food groups that protect against major sources of death and disability for humans. And our simplistic scenarios of a full pollinator loss, we found that they were significantly important to preventing major death and disease, mainly through their role in supporting healthy disease-fighting foods rather than micronutrients. And yet we also find that the current population of wild pollinators is insufficient to provide optimal amounts of food to support human health, and that inadequate pollination is causing 3 to 5% losses in healthy food group production, leading to over 400,000 deaths per year. And I'll end by just emphasizing, I guess, the need for urgency, as these problems are only going to get worse unless we make a concerted effort to help pollinators survive and flourish in this rapidly changing world. So thank you.
Fantastic, Matt. Thank you so much for that presentation. We have Frank Hu here to sort of help us with a little bit of a discussion. And Frank, I mean, I'd love to just kind of hear a reflection from you as one of the world's leading sort of epidemiologists of cardiometabolic disease. How often does your community get together and talk about pollinators as an important source of heart disease risk? And sort of how do you take this in? And yeah, I'd just love to hear your thoughts.
Well, thank you, Lucas and Matt, for really fascinating talk. To answer your question, Sam, this is the first time I heard any presentations about bees and the pollinators in the context of nutrition. But what I'm going to say in a few words is is to put what Lucas and Matt discussed in the context of a global nutrition landscape. Currently, we're facing triple threats of obesity, undernutrition, and climate change. Globally, we have 2 billion people who are overweight and obese, and another 2 billion people who are underweight or undernourished. In the meantime, the world population will grow from about 7.5 billion today to 10 billion people in 2 to 3 decades. So a major global public health challenge is how to feed 10 billion people a healthy and sustainable diet in 2050. So 2 years ago, the Lancet Commission proposed the so-called planetary health diet, which is designed to improve both human and planetary health. And this dietary pattern is characterized by high intake of fruits and vegetables, whole grains, legumes, nuts, and unsaturated fats, moderate consumption of seafood, poultry, and dairy products, lower consumption of red and processed meats, added sugar, refined grains, and highly processed foods. We estimated that a shift from current dietary pattern to the planetary health dietary pattern could prevent 12 million deaths per year globally. So this is really huge. It accounts for about 20 to 25% of total deaths globally each year. And this dietary pattern also has the potential to feed 10 billion people a healthy diet within the planetary boundaries in 2050. So as Matt just mentioned, if we want to shift from current dietary pattern to the optimal diet, there's going to be a huge changes in our eating habits and also agricultural practice. And this means that the global consumption of meats and sugar have to be reduced by 50%, where the consumption of healthy plant-based foods such as fruits and vegetables, nuts, legumes must double. And it also means that we need to reorient our agricultural priorities from producing high quantity of less healthy foods, especially meats, to producing more healthy plant-based foods, such as fruits and vegetables, whole grains, nuts, seeds, and legumes. And as both Matt and Lucas just mentioned, the production of those healthy plant-based foods requires the help of our friends, the bees and the pollinators. Without them, we wouldn't be able to produce those healthy plant-based foods. And so just recap some of the key points. The global decline in bee populations and the pollinators poses a serious threat to a wide variety of plants critical to human nutrition. One potential consequence is that the production of nutritionist crops, such as fruits, vegetables, nuts, will be reduced and replaced by less nutritionist crops like rice, corn, and potatoes. This will exacerbate the malnutrition problems, especially in developing countries. And also the production of other plant foods, such as coffee and cocoa, that rely on pollination, will also be severely affected. I think, especially for coffee, that will be bad news for a lot of people. And coffee, of course, is not just important for our mood, for physical health, but also mental health, but also for our physical health, because regular consumption of coffee has been associated with reduced risk of diabetes and other chronic diseases. And then finally, the decline in bee populations and the pollinators and the decline in nutrition quality of human diets is strongly correlated with each other, and both are accelerated by climate change. So I'm going to stop here, and we have about 20 minutes for Q&As. I know we already have some questions in the chat. Let me stop sharing.
Frank, before you go to the chat questions, I guess I had one or two questions for the group. One was actually for Matt, where you were talking about the changes in income for these agricultural sort of lower income countries that were really substantial changes. And was that modeled as a health effect? In other words, are we missing the potential health effects of all of that lost income in poor countries?
I mean, certainly we're missing out. That was not explicitly modeled as part of this study. But as you can imagine, increased incomes for these populations are going to have tremendous impacts on their health because they're able to access health services at a higher rate. I mean, yeah, just the relationship between higher incomes and better health is pretty well known. And so that is a link that was not directly established as part of the study, but certainly one that is going to be huge, especially for these low-income countries where they have the most to gain by improving their pollinator populations and thereby their yields.
That makes sense. And I had one more quick question for Lucas, which is, Lucas, you have a real interest in the policy dimension of your work and have been very focused on how to bring the science into policy. And I'm curious how this kind of research that actually quantifies human health implications and can also be done at the national scale. So you could go to national governments and say, here's the health burden associated with insufficient pollinators in this country, combined with some of this economic data, whether you see this as a powerful sort of tool in trying to move policy around the sort of pollinator friendly practices that you've done so much work on.
Yes, especially because governments invest also in health burdens, and that money could be saved if people have better diets and better nutrition. And we have also estimated the cost and benefits of restoring natural and semi-natural areas in agricultural lands. And this is a paper that has been published this year. And it is already incorporated in the CBD. I will copy later the citation in the chat. So we have found that in most agricultural landscapes, you can restore nature to a 20% without losing income for the farming companies. So this means restoring nature where it's degraded or where land is almost all cultivated. So these are also important aspects that if you include the spatial heterogeneity and the opportunity cost of that this natural habitat cannot be used for croplands, still you can still restore a lot of natural and semi-natural habitats and provide many benefits to human health through nutrition, but also through other nature contributions to people that are also important for our good quality of life. So yeah, that pathway is one that we have been working a lot lately, and we were lucky enough that it was already incorporated into the CBD, and they will take it into account with this. You know that the HE biodiversity targets need to be renewed, and they are going to take these ideas for the next targets.
Hey, there are a few questions in the chat. The first question is for you, Lucas. In the PNAS 2011 paper, the yield variability looks like there are bigger yield peaks in the 95% plot. I'm assuming it's not actual yield maximums. This looks like a very specific question. So perhaps this person can communicate with you offline, because this is about a data point in your PNAS 2011 paper.
Okay.
Let me ask the second question to you or Matt. Could the prolonged use of pesticides be creating pollinators resistant to these materials?
That's a good question. It might actually be a better one for Lucas, because he knows pollinators better than I do. I haven't heard of any pollinator resistant or pesticide resistant pollinators out there. They seem to be mostly suffering from pesticide use rather than growing superpowers. But I don't know. Do you know of any kind of growing pesticide resistance in pollinators, Lucas?
No, there are different susceptibility for different species. For example, honeybees with large colonies, they are less susceptible than other species, but I haven't heard about resistance yet.
That's the interesting question. My follow-up question to this question is, Matt, you suggested that organic farming can help to protect pollinators. So to what degree this practice can, I guess, restore the pollinators?
Sure. I mean, it's really across several dimensions that it's able to help. So one is the reduced use of those pesticides, especially really harmful pesticides like neonicotinoids that have been shown to have severe severe effects on colony insects. So by reducing the use of pesticides or eliminating pesticides altogether, that's really beneficial. By limiting the tilling of practices, I think it kind of allows for ground nesting bees to survive on farm by either reducing or eliminating tilling altogether. It allows kind of nests to be more integrated into the farms. And so, yeah, those are both the ways that it's able to benefit. And I also wanted to kind of return to something you had said, Frank, which was about talking about this planetary health diet and the increased needs that we're going to have to need so much more fruits and vegetables and nuts in the future to achieve kind of health and environmental outcomes. And if we aren't able to kind of grow the pollinators that are necessary to support those yields that are necessary in that planetary health diet, then we're going to really need to rely on some of these more detrimental industrial practices, such as increased fertilizers and agrochemicals and pesticides and huge monoculture farms that are not only bad for bees and the environment, but potentially could be bad for human health. So yeah, I'll say that switching to our practices, a lot of potential benefits here.
Right. So your analysis in the Lancet paper and also your ongoing study focus on fruits, vegetables, and nuts. Of course, those are very important, healthy plant-based foods. But pollinators also play a very important role in the production of legumes, coffee, and other plants. So I was wondering why you didn't take into account the beneficial effects of other plant-based foods.
Good question. So, well, we actually, I didn't mention it, but we did take into account legumes. They had a much smaller effect than the others. So I didn't include them because they were almost negligible. We didn't include coffee. And I was thinking that when you were talking about all the potential benefits to diabetes and mental health, because I was like, oh, that would be a good thing to include. But I think we had relied on some of the work I think that maybe Marco Springman had done for that Eat Lancet Commission report. And I don't believe that coffee was included, or the health benefits of coffee were included in that study. So I think that's probably why, but something to consider for sure.
Yeah, this may be a separate paper, but from nutrition IP point of view, the evidence for coffee is much more consistent and more robust than other food groups. So it's quite interesting. There is a question about the map. I think Lucas showed, or Matt showed, the map of impact of lost pollinators on nutrition intake suggests a lower loss for sub-Saharan African countries. Is this because of the continent has lower dependence on pollinators, or that the diets are still predominantly based on stable crops, stable crops?
So those maps that really showed kind of really low impacts in sub-Saharan Africa are primarily due to Yes, high reliance on staple crops, but also just low incidence of a lot of these chronic diseases that would be alleviated by these problems. So yeah, I think that there are a lot of other causes of death and disability that are affecting these parts of the world, and rates of heart disease and cancer are just not high enough such as in Eastern Europe, that they just don't feel such an effect of that protective effect from healthy food groups.
Right. Yeah, there is a question direct to me. Food and nutrition is responsible for 30% of greenhouse gas emissions, yet changing food and diets is often portrayed as individual choice, and the individual choices are often viewed as futile, as one drop in the bucket. Well, yeah, that's a very important question. I mean, there has been long-standing debate about whether diet and nutrition is the individual responsibility or social responsibility. I think it's both. I think policies and the government actions now play more and more important role in terms of changing food environment and also influence individual eating behaviors and food choices. So that's why I think there is a great emphasis on agriculture and food policies and practices that can improve our overall food environment, make healthy foods such as fruits and vegetables, nuts, seeds, and legumes more accessible, more affordable, and become the food of choices in many places, including cafeterias and school lunch programs and so on and so forth. So again, I think both individual responsibilities and social responsibilities are important, but I think we have to put greater emphasis on the role of policies and regulations that can help to improve the overall food environment.
All right, well, I might jump in since we only have just a couple more minutes to give a really heartfelt thanks to Lucas and Matt and Frank for a really dynamic presentation. I think it's a really interesting sort of example of planetary health research in general. We find these really sort of systems thinking is required to do this kind of work, where you see what are often sort of hard to anticipate health effects as a result of biophysical changes that really ripple through quite complex systems, and therefore it takes a very high degree of interdisciplinarity and bringing together multiple skill sets to do this kind of work. But when you do, it can be really rewarding. So really, really lovely talks, and thank you. I want to also let everybody know that the next talk in the Planetary Health Colloquium series is going to be in a month on January 5th. These are running every first Wednesday of the month, so it'll be Wednesday at 1 o'clock on January 5th, and we'll be moving. We've sort of gone from an introductory talk to a focus on the sort of infectious disease domain to now nutrition. We're going to move to this topic of non-communicable diseases more broadly, and have another really rich panel with our own Francesca Dominici talking about her work on wildfires and particulate air pollution and how they're affecting COVID, as well as Phil Landrigan, who runs the Pollution Center at Boston College and led the Lancet Commission on Pollution and Health, who will be talking about that assessment and the health effects of global pollution. And then Pauline Schielbeck, who's going to be talking about some really interesting work on how sea level rise and water resource management led to saltwater intrusion in coastal aquifers in Bangladesh, which led to eclampsia in pregnant women and also hypertension in coastal adult populations. So all very different mechanisms for how human-driven biophysical changes ultimately come back to affect the burden of non-communicable diseases. So that will be coming up in a month, and we'll continue on really through April or May. So thank you for being with us. We've recorded the series, and it will be available on our website, and it was wonderful to have you all.
Thank you. Okay, bye.
All right, bye-bye. Thanks so much.
Thanks, everyone.